Although few Americans are probably aware of it, back during the Vietnam War, America extensively bombed the neighboring country of Laos. And the legacy of that bombing continues to this day, wreaking havoc for the people living in that country, particularly because of unexploded ordnance, the bombs that we drop that don't go off for years or decades afterward. And this is especially a huge problem in Laos because of our use of cluster munitions. And so in this video, we're going to talk about the consequences, the deadly consequences of using those types of weapons. So cluster bombs, if you don't know, the casings release hundreds of bomblets the size of a soup can or an orange over wide areas, frequently missing intended military targets and killing nearby civilians. The purpose of these munitions is to be released over huge areas to kill as many people and wreak as much devastation as possible. It is the exact opposite of smart munitions. It's intended to damage over huge areas of geography of these countries. And in many cases, these bomblets, because they're made en masse, don't explode, a significant portion, which we're going to get to. More than 98% of known cluster bomb victims to this point are civilians, and 40% are children, particularly in the years following the military conflicts in which the cluster bombs are initially dropped. To give you an idea of how extensive the use of these bombs is, or was, from 1964 to 1973, the U.S. dropped over 2 million tons of ordnance over Laos in 580,000 bombing missions, the equivalent of one plane load every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years. At least 270 million cluster bomblets were dropped as part of the bombing campaign. Approximately 80 million failed to detonate. This is not a problem of several dozen of these scattered through the countryside of Laos. 80 million did not explode over basically the entirety of that country. Now, data from a survey conducted in Laos back in 2009 indicated that unexploded ordnance, including cluster bombs, have killed or maimed as many as 50,000 civilians in Laos since 1964 and 20,000 since 1973 after the war ended. Over the past 2 years, there have been over 100 new casualties each year. This is decades after the war. About 60% of accidents result in death, and 40% of the victims are children. Boys are particularly at risk because you can simply go out into the countryside, into farmland, around your villages, and there's a good chance that somewhere in that vicinity there is unexploded ordnance that children will often be drawn to because they look like small toys. Now, over the past 4 decades, less than 1% of the bomblets that failed to detonate have been cleared, over the past 4 decades, I should say. And so we have this dark legacy of 80 million cluster munitions, the small bomblets, that have been left strewn over the countryside. In that entire time, only about 1% has actually been taken out. And it is an extremely complicated process to slowly sweep an area with metal detectors, to finally find one of the bomblets, and then to detonate them under controlled circumstances. It can take months to clear a single acre, and we're talking about an entire country. Now, you might ask, considering the fact that we were the ones who dropped it when we weren't even formally at war, they were just simply tangential next to, on the supply lines of some of the Vietnamese forces, the North Vietnamese forces, perhaps we could do something to get rid of this. And in fact, we have given some money over the past 4 decades. For years, the U.S. averaged an annual contribution of between $2 million and $2.5 million for unexploded ordnance clearance, a sum that stands in stark contrast to the $13.3 million a day that the U.S. spent bombing Laos over a 9-year period. And so, as in so many other areas of government, and especially in areas of war, actually spending money on bombing the country is always going to be significantly more popular than taking out the bombs that you dropped in the first case. And we're talking exponentially more money spent to drop the bombs than to clear them. To protect the lives of the civilians that had no stake in that war. Many of them weren't even alive at that time. Now, thankfully, under President Obama, things are going to accelerate. And that's the good news in this edition of Final Judgment. President Obama has said that we are going to give $90 million to help clean up the munitions, which is certainly much more than we have given over the past few decades, and still is only a small fraction of the money necessary to clear these areas, to allow the people of Laos to farm in these areas, travel in these areas, to reclaim their country. And looking at it from a broader view, there is probably nothing that we can do, including giving $90 million or even more, that can begin to repair the damage that we did by choosing decades ago to use cluster munitions across the country of Laos. But if there's anything we can do in any small way to make the country even more, slightly more livable for future generations of people living in Laos, then we have a moral, obvious obligation to do so. This should be considered, regardless of the dollar value, as just the first step. And that's my final judgment.